Welcome this morning to the Pastor's Cut. This is our fourth week now of St. Luke's on Broadway, and we just got through looking at Guys and Dolls. It's one of these incredibly popular musicals that has been around now since 1950 and has entertained millions of people. Each week we're trying to look at some of the values that we find in these great musicals, values and messages that we believe are proclaimed in our scripture. And this past week we were remembering the Roman soldiers who were gambling, throwing dice at the foot of the cross as Jesus died, totally unaware of what was going right above their heads. Well, the theme in Guys and Dolls is very much all about gambling. It's about gangsters. It's about dolls. You can see really the time that the short story was first written back in the 1930s. And that was the time in Broadway, in New York, and it was a time when the mob was flourishing. In fact, Sonny Franzese, the father of Michael that I talked about on Sunday, this would have been his time in history, and we know how violent it was, and how I told you his father, Sonny, earlier this year just got out of prison. He was 100 years old. Well, it was Damon Runyon who loved everything Broadway, everything New York, and he wrote the story, The Idol of Miss Sarah Brown. And that started creating this character and this story that would ultimately be expanded by Frank Loesser and Abe Burrows and made into this musical in 1950. Runyon, though, when he wrote the story, did a fascinating thing. He wrote what became known as Runyonese. He had all the characters speak, but without contractions. Stop and think about what your sentence would be like if you did not add contractions into your sentence. And so that gave a real distinctive flavor to the speaking of the characters in Guys and Dolls. If you go back and listen carefully, it is a real whole different flavor, a different language. It's called Runyonese. He died in 1946 of throat cancer. He had been a smoker. He was 66 years old. When he died, it was Eddie Rickenbacker, the great pilot, the war hero from World War II, who managed to get a DC-3, and Damon Runyon had his body cremated, and it was Eddie Rickenbacker who flew it over New York, down Broadway, and dumped his ashes illegally all over Broadway. I can imagine how people may have felt that day if they didn't understand they were walking down Broadway and suddenly they were getting covered in a strange fine dust. Now that's where Damon Runyon wanted his ashes spread. Well, I told you how the show came out in 1950 and was very successful. But then it was Samuel Goldwyn who loved gambling and loved this idea of the gangsters in Broadway who wanted to make a movie. And so he did. He took the story and made a movie. I watched that movie a week ago on Sunday night, just to refresh my memory. I'd seen the show years before, and I remember watching the movie and getting through, and I literally texted Wendy Lambert, who helped to choose these shows, and I said, what the heck am I going to preach about? There didn't seem to be a lot of socially redeeming value. Entertainment, good songs, yes, but what was the redeeming value? It's then I began digging into the Broadway show versus the movie. And what I discovered was Samuel Goldwyn had 3 songs added to the movie that were not in the play, and these songs are rather risque. He cut 5 songs from the show, from the Broadway musical to the movie, 5 songs that didn't make it into the movie, and they were songs like, it was Bushel and a Peck, Marry the Man Today. That's again one where the 2 women are visiting with one another, Adelaide and Sarah, trying to visit with one another at the end of the show, deciding, do we marry these men? And the final conclusion was, you can't alter the dress until you buy it. We need to go ahead and marry these men, and we will pray that God will help us to make them become what they need to be. That's not a great plan. I don't encourage that, but that's what the song was actually about. And both women decide to marry their men. My Time of Day was cut. We heard that on Sunday, and that's where you have the promise or the confession of Sky. My name is Obadiah, about becoming real. They cut that out of the movie. They cut the song, I've Never Been in Love Before, which again brings about a whole different feeling and ending to the show. And they cut More I Cannot Wish You, the song about everyone needs to love and to be loved. The songs that I lifted up on Sunday are all the songs that got cut out of the movie. And it brought a very different feel to the movie versus what we saw on Broadway. You know, that song, More I Cannot Wish You, it was sung by Ed Ames, Bing Crosby, Harry Connick Jr., and Paul McCartney. No, there was something about that song that really spoke to people's souls. And that was such an important song in the Broadway show. And to cut that out of the movie, well, it changed things dramatically. And finally, I told you about Michael Franzese on Sunday. You spell his last name Franzese. He's a fascinating man that's 67 years old, left the mob more than 20 years ago now. You can look him up on YouTube and find many fascinating interviews as he talks about his life in the mob and the people that he knew, and talking about all kinds of historical things because of being a part of the mob. His father, I told you, was Sonny, who just got out of prison not long ago when he was 100. He has some fascinating stories to tell, but I shared with you how he was in prison, and that's where he really began growing in his faith. He wasn't sure that he could survive that time in prison, but his favorite verse that really gave him hope was Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I didn't read it to you on Sunday. I told you to go home and to look it up. But in case you didn't, I wanted to read you the verse that Michael found to be the verse that gave him hope in those most difficult days. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. That's a great thought as we begin this new week. Next week, we're going to wind up looking at Mamma Mia, one of the most popular musicals in history. The following week, we're going to look at Frozen, brand new on Broadway. We're going to finish strong. I hope to see you here. Have a great week.